Welcome everybody to the first class of this year. And our topic as usual is to take something in the Parsha and the weekly Torah portion and to connect it to psychology. The Parsha this week is, I debated a little about what to teach about. Are we going to learn about the Parsha, which is hazinum, or about Yom Kippur? So we'll try to bring them both together under one roof and see if that works. The Parsha hazinum is basically almost all of it, except for the last few verses, is a song. It's lyric. And there are even opinions that the mitzvah to write a book, a Torah scroll that every person has, is really just to write down this part of the Torah, this Parashat hazinum, just the song of hazinum. And this was a song that Moshe Rabbeinu sang or spoke on the day of his passing. And it's usually described as a history of the Jewish people from beginning to end. There's a very interesting concept that there's a beginning to history and there's an end to history, right? If you would speak to a scientist, he might not realize that there's a beginning and an end. Beginning, maybe some scientists would agree there's a beginning at some point when civilization began, maybe when we started documenting history. But the idea that there's an end to history, end in the sense of a termination, right? There's a famous book that was written 10 years ago by Francis Fukuyama, who's one of the masters, one would say, of political science. And he called it the end of history. And people thought that he would become religious, but he hadn't. He meant the end in the sense of what is the purpose of history. So when we say that it's the end of the history of the Jewish people, we mean the termination, not the purpose. But obviously, the two are connected. That the moment that you reach the purpose, you've actually reached the termination of whatever that stage is. So the Parsha of hazinum is a very complex, very mysterious one. It's very hard to decipher the language. Even if you speak Hebrew fluently and you're well versed in it, it's a very hard song to understand. The words are just strange, even compared to the rest of the Torah. They remind us a lot of the lyric style used in Job. And the sages, I think, based on hazinum, say that one of the possibilities of who wrote Job is Moses himself, because of the similarity in the language. So it's very hard to decipher it, very hard to understand what it wants. So we're not going to take it apart. We're just going to use the first word. And we're going to use the first word to introduce a very important topic in psychology, maybe one of the most important topics. What does hazinum mean? Literally, it's usually explained, listen or hearken, as it's used in more flourishy language. Listen, lehazin. But in Hebrew, there's something very interesting about the word listen, which is derived from the same word that means ear, right? And ozen is an ear. Ha'azinu means listen. What do you do with your ears? You listen. But the ear itself, the word ear, actually means also to balance. Le'azen, in Hebrew, the verb, if you turn the ear into a verb, which is actually the root, explain something very basic about Hebrew. Hebrew, unlike English, does not begin with nouns. It begins with verbs. So when you say Aleph, Zayin, Nun, Ozen, it's really Izen. That would be not the infinitive form, but the root form of ear. And it means to balance. Now, we all know that there's an intrinsic connection between our ears and our ability to balance. So really, if we would use this word, hazinum, in its literal meaning as balancing, so the first verse of this week's Parsha is telling us to balance the heavens and the earth. So it's not just haazinu hashamayim v'adabera v'tishma haaretz imrei pi. It's not just listen, or may the heavens listen and I will speak, and the earth will hear the words of my mouth. But rather, I want to balance the heavens so that I may speak with the earth so that my words be heard. Balance is a tremendous concept in psychology, and it may be the essence of what the Jewish people are. We're the balancing act of the world, balancing between heaven and earth. Most spiritual, or even not spiritual, traditions are lopsided. They either go too far into the heavens or too low into the earth. And it's a very hard thing to balance the heavens and the earth because they're opposites. So like any two opposites, it's a challenge. So right away, let's say, what is the Jewish secret to balancing? It's that in order to balance, you have to have a middle point. You can't balance without a middle point. It's a very interesting thing that Maimonides writes regarding behavior. He says, any type of behavior that we have has to be in the middle. It has to follow the middle path. The middle path is the right path for every type of behavior that a person has. So in terms of giving charity, he says, you can't be too miserly, meaning holding back your money, not being willing to give it to good causes. And on the other hand, you can't be too open-handed and just giving it to whoever wants. You have to be somewhere in the middle. But Maimonides says something amazing about the middle. He says, and this is something that's discussed by many commentaries on him. He says, if you're too miserly, the way to fix it is to open your hands to a great degree. And then after you act contrary to your nature for a while, you'll even out in the middle. The question that's asked is, why don't you just aim for the middle right away? Why not? Since you're going from one extreme to the other, well, you have to pass the middle on the way. So why not just stop there? So the answer that's usually given is that the middle is an art. You can't understand the middle until you understand the two extremes. You have to be able to fully comprehend both sides in order to eventually realize that the two sides are coming out of a common ancestor. They've just taken an extreme view of their source. But you have to be able to understand the two sides in order to join them together in the middle. So that's the usual answer that's given, that why Maimonides doesn't just say aim for the middle, because you can't really just aim there. You have to first visit the other side. You have to understand the other side. In today's world, we have well, maybe this is a simplistic understanding, but in general, we have what we call the East and we have the West. And the East and West, when I was growing up, was basically the Soviet Union and the communist bloc, and then the United States and the free world. But obviously, it's expanded since then. And when you think about the East, you talk usually about Islam and the autocratic or totalitarian regimes in the Far East, China, North Korea, places that are built on very, very strong hierarchy. And in the West, you find Christianity and the freedom of the West, which goes in a completely different direction. And then you ask, so where do the Jewish people belong? And so it's a very legitimate question. It's a question that everybody deals with, especially when you're in the land of Israel. Do we identify more with the United States? Do we identify more with Saudi Arabia, let's say? In some areas, we identify more with Islam. And in some areas, we identify more with Christianity. Both of them are lopsided as far as Judaism is concerned. I mean, they both have some truth to them, but they've taken their truth to an extreme that is suffering from a lack of balance. And so the role of the Jewish people smack in the middle of everything is somehow to bring balance to this. You can't run away from, George Lucas and the prophecy of the one that will bring balance to the force. So if you want to look at it that way, that's fine too. But really the essence of what Moses is parting with, he's telling us our whole history is understand that you have to find balance. That's what you're really searching for, because there are two opposite extremes in life. And the secret to bringing balance is finding the middle that connects them. So that's going to be our topic today, about that middle that connects these two extremes. And again, extremes can be in many different areas. It can be political, it can be economic, it can be religious, it can be behavioral, it could be in marital relationships. In every area that we look, and most particularly in ourselves, in our psychology, we have to find a way to find that middle. So that middle, let's start with the fact it has a name in Judaism. It's not just a concept. It actually has a name. So this is a very interesting thing that, so many, in the last generation, I'm sorry that I'm not very well versed in his books, but I know that he wrote about this and he thought that this was a very important topic for him. But Rabbi Sachs, who was the chief rabbi of England, he passed away this year. He wrote a lot about Judaism being the balance, or seeing ourselves as the balance between the East and the West, between Christianity and Islam, and so on. But if I'm not mistaken, he didn't speak about the principle that in order to balance, you need to find the middle. The middle is a separate entity. It's not just that was the point before about Maimonides, that the middle is not the middle between two extremes. It's something entirely different. In fact, in Judaism, when we want to picture the middle, we don't put it on the same plane as the two extremes. One way to see this is, for instance, if you look at the Star of David being two triangles, one right side up and the other upside down, and they're interlocked. So what does each one of the triangles symbolize? It could be many, many things, but one of the ideas is simply that you have the horizontal line being the two extremes, 2 points. The middle then, let's see if I can do this with looking at how I look on the screen. The middle then is not here. It's rather, I can't do it. See, it's hard. It's here. It's on a different plane, stressing that the middle is its own entity. In Tikkunei Zohar, which is one of the most important texts of the Kabbalah, the introduction contains a section from Elijah. Elijah gives this teaching, which is considered to be a very basic teaching that encapsulates all of the Lurianic Kabbalah in one short paragraph. We say it every Friday night. And there he says that the sfirot, the faculties, the powers through which God creates and sustains the world, are divided along three axes. A right longer axis, a left shorter axis, but then there's the middle axis, which runs from infinitely high to infinitely low. And the middle axis is the novelty. It's the chiddush. It's the thing that wasn't just clear to everybody that you had to assume that there was also a third axis. People just thought that if there's a left and there's a right, well, it might be then that whatever's in between the left and the right, that's the middle. But to say that there's a separate axis is a new idea. It's a new concept. And so in Judaism, 3 becomes the most important number in terms of understanding the balancing act of life. So when we talk about balance, we have a name for it. It's not just the middle axis. It's also the sfirot, the faculties, the powers of the soul that run along the middle axis. And starting from the crown and then the knowledge, da'at, and so on. But the most important is da'at. And da'at means literally knowledge, but it can also mean consciousness. But you could really call it, in a certain sense, not just consciousness, but conscientiousness, meaning being aware that we are always in a position in which we need to make a decision, that we're always, in a certain sense, judging ourselves and looking at ourselves as like living our lives as if we were a balance ourselves, that everything in life is a balancing act. And there's no simple way to just choose one extreme and follow it, but rather you're always in a conundrum. You're always questioning what exactly is the balance between these different opposing forces in life. And that's basically what Moses leaves us with before he departs the world. He's saying that you have to learn how to balance. So to make this a little bit more concrete, what I'd like to do is something that I haven't done until now. Usually don't do this because there's so much to talk about, but by Hashgacha, by divine providence, I was reading something from Rabbi Sachs earlier, and he sent me to a TED Talk, which I thought was a good idea to share. And I think that this TED, I want us all to watch it together, so I'm going to share it in a moment on the screen. I think that this TED Talk is one of the things that really sparked his imagination and his thinking. And once we hear it, I think you'll be very impressed by it. I'm not sure that every single neuroscientist would agree with the presenter. There's probably debate about it, but I think that it gives a beautiful picture, at least one possible picture of how the mind is divided between the left and right hemispheres. And interestingly, even this very thoughtful woman misses the point of the middle. She never discusses it. And that's basically what I'd like to do when we get back. So, so hopefully you'll bear with the presentation. It's about, let me see how long it is. It's, I lost it for a second. Yeah, it's I'm getting a YouTube commercial. Just a second. Oh. It is a little long, so hopefully you'll bear with it. So let me share this. Let me share this with you. Oh. Lana, do you have control? Hope somebody has control. We need the screen sharing. Okay, there we go.
What do I do?
Yeah, you it's fine. I have it now. Okay, and let me just make sure that you guys can hear it well. There's something I need to do to make that happen. Oh, let me try it again. Share sound. Okay, here we go. So that's much better.
I grew up to study the brain because I have a brother who has been diagnosed with a brain disorder, schizophrenia. And as a sister, and later as a scientist, I wanted to understand, why is it that I can take my dreams, I can connect them to my reality, and I can make my dreams come true? What is it about my brother's brain and his schizophrenia that he cannot connect his dreams to a common and shared reality, so they instead become delusion? So I dedicated my career to research into the severe mental illnesses, and I moved from my home state of Indiana to Boston, where I was working in the lab of Dr. Francine Bennis in the Harvard Department of Psychiatry. And in the lab, we were asking the question, what are the biological differences between the brains of individuals who would be diagnosed as normal control, as compared with the brains of individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, or bipolar disorder? So we were essentially mapping the microcircuitry of the brain, which cells are communicating with which cells, with which chemicals, and then in what quantities of those chemicals. So there was a lot of meaning in my life because I was performing this type of research during the day, but then in the evenings and on the weekends, I traveled as an advocate for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. But on the morning of December 10, 1996, I woke up to discover that I had a brain disorder of my own. A blood vessel exploded in the left half of my brain. And in the course of 4 hours, I watched my brain completely deteriorate in its ability to process all information. On the morning of the hemorrhage, I could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of my life. I essentially became an infant in a woman's body. If you've ever seen a human brain, it's obvious that the two hemispheres are completely separate from one another. And I have brought for you a real human brain. Thank you. So this is a real human brain. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain with the spinal cord hanging down. And this is how it would be positioned inside of my head. And when you look at the brain, it's obvious that the two cerebral cortices are completely separate from one another. For those of you who understand computers, our right hemisphere functions like a parallel processor, while our left hemisphere functions like a serial processor. The two hemispheres do communicate with one another through the corpus callosum, which is made up of some 300 million axonal fibers. But other than that, the two hemispheres are completely separate. Because they process information differently, each of our hemispheres think about different things, they care about different things, and dare I say, they have very different personalities. Excuse me. Thank you. It's been a joy. Our right human hemisphere is all about this present moment. It's all about right here, right now. Our right hemisphere, it thinks in pictures, and it learns kinesthetically through the movement of our bodies. Information in the form of energy streams in simultaneously through all of our sensory systems, and then it explodes into this enormous collage of what this present moment looks like, what this present moment smells like and tastes like, what it feels like, and what it sounds like. I am an energy being connected to the energy all around me through the consciousness of my right hemisphere. We are energy beings connected to one another through the consciousness of our right hemispheres as one human family. And right here, right now, we are brothers and sisters on this planet, here to make the world a better place. And in this moment, we are perfect, we are whole, and we are beautiful. My left hemisphere, our left hemisphere, is a very different place. Our left hemisphere thinks linearly and methodically. Our left hemisphere is all about the past, and it's all about the future. Our left hemisphere is designed to take that enormous collage of the present moment and start picking out details, and more details about those details. It then categorizes and organizes all that information, associates it with everything in the past we've ever learned, and projects into the future all of our possibilities. And our left hemisphere thinks in language. It's that ongoing brain chatter that connects me and my internal world to my external world. It's that little voice that says to me, hey, you got to remember to pick up bananas on your way home. I need them in the morning. It's that calculating intelligence that reminds me when I have to do my laundry. But perhaps most important, it's that little voice that says to me, I am. I am. And as soon as my left hemisphere says to me, I am, I become separate. I become a single, solid individual, separate from the energy flow around me and separate from you. And this is the portion of my brain that I lost on the morning of my stroke. On the morning of the stroke, I woke up to a pounding pain behind my left eye. And it was the kind of pain, caustic pain, that you get when you bite into ice cream. And it just gripped me, and then it released me. And then it just gripped me, and then it released me. And it was very unusual for me to ever experience any kind of pain, so I thought, okay, I'll just start my normal routine. So I got up and I jumped onto my cardia glider, which is a full body, full exercise machine. And I'm jamming away on this thing, and I'm realizing that my hands look like primitive claws grasping onto the bar. And I thought, that's very peculiar. And I looked down at my body, and I thought, whoa, I'm a weird looking thing. And it was as though my consciousness had shifted away from my normal perception of reality, where I'm the person on the machine having the experience, to some esoteric space where I'm witnessing myself having this experience. And it was all very peculiar, and my headache was just getting worse. So I get off the machine, and I'm walking across my living room floor, and I realize that everything inside of my body has slowed way down. And every step is very rigid and very deliberate. There's no fluidity to my pace, and there's this constriction in my area of perception, so I'm just focused on internal systems. And I'm standing in my bathroom getting ready to step into the shower, and I could actually hear the dialogue inside of my body. I heard a little voice saying, okay, you muscles, you got to contract, and you muscles, you relax. And then I lost my balance, and I'm propped up against the wall. And I looked down at my arm, and I realized that I can no longer define the boundaries of my body. I can't define where I begin and where I end, because the atoms and the molecules of my arm blended with the atoms and molecules of the wall. And all I could detect was this energy. And I'm asking myself, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And in that moment, my brain chatter, my left hemisphere brain chatter, went totally silent. Just like someone took a remote control and pushed the mute button. Total silence. And at first I was shocked to find myself inside of a silent mind. But then I was immediately captivated by the magnificence of the energy around me. And because I could no longer identify the boundaries of my body, I felt enormous and expansive. I felt at one with all the energy that was, and it was beautiful there. And then all of a sudden, my left hemisphere comes back online, and it says to me, hey, we got a problem, we got to get some help. And I'm going, oh, I got a problem. So it's like, okay, I got a problem. But then I immediately drifted right back out into the consciousness, and I affectionately refer to this space as La La Land. But it was beautiful there. Imagine what it would be like to be totally disconnected from your brain chatter that connects you to the external world. So here I am in this space, and my job and any stress related to my job, it was gone. And I felt lighter in my body. And imagine all of the relationships in the external world and any stressors related to any of those, they were gone. And I felt this sense of peacefulness. And imagine what it would feel like to lose 37 years of emotional baggage. Oh, I felt euphoria. It was beautiful there. And then again, my left hemisphere comes online, and it says, hey, you've got to pay attention. We've got to get help. And I'm thinking, I got to get help. I got to focus. So I get out of the shower, and I'm mechanically dressed, and I'm walking around my apartment, and I'm thinking, I got to get to work. Can I drive? And in that moment, my right arm went totally paralyzed by my side. Then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke. And then the next thing my brain says to me is, wow, this is so cool. How many brain scientists have the opportunity to study their own brain from the inside out? And then it crosses my mind, but I'm a very busy woman. I don't have time for a stroke. It's like, okay, can't stop the stroke from happening, so I'll do this for a week or two, and then I'll get back to my routine. Okay, so I got to call help. I got to call work. I could remember the number at work. So I remembered in my office, I had a business card with my number on it. So I go into my business room and pull out a 3-inch stack of business cards. And I'm looking at the card on top. And even though I could see clearly in my mind's eye what my business card looked like, I couldn't tell if this was my card or not, because all I could see were pixels. And the pixels of the words blended with the pixels of the background and the pixels of the symbols, and I just couldn't tell. And then I would wait for what I call a wave of clarity. And in that moment, I would be able to reattach to normal reality. And I could tell, that's not the card, that's not the card, that's not the card. It took me 45 minutes to get 1 inch down inside of that stack of cards. In the meantime, for 45 minutes, the hemorrhage is getting bigger in my left hemisphere. I do not understand numbers. I do not understand a telephone, but it's the only plan I have. So I take the phone pad and I put it right here. I take the business card, I put it right here, and I'm matching the shape of the squiggles on the card to the shape of the squiggles on the phone pad. But then I would drift back out into La La Land and not remember when I come back if I'd already dialed those numbers. So I had to wield my paralyzed arm like a stump and cover the numbers as I went along and push them so that as I would come back to normal reality, I'd be able to tell, yes, I've already dialed that number. Eventually, the whole number gets dialed, and I'm listening to the phone, and my colleague picks up the phone, and he says to me, and I think to myself, oh my gosh, he sounds like a golden retriever. And so I say to him, clear in my mind, I say to him, this is Jill, I need help. And what comes out of my voice is, and I think, oh my gosh, I sound like a golden retriever. So I didn't know that I couldn't speak or understand language until I tried. So he recognizes that I need help, and he gets me help. And a little while later, I'm riding in an ambulance from one hospital across Boston to Mass General Hospital. And I curl up into a little fetal ball. And just like a balloon, with the last bit of air just right out of the balloon, I just felt my energy lift, and I felt my spirit surrender. And in that moment, I knew that I was no longer the choreographer of my life, and either the doctors rescue my body and give me a second chance at life, or this was perhaps my moment of transition. When I woke later that afternoon, I was shocked to discover that I was still alive. When I felt my spirit surrender, I said goodbye to my life, and my mind was now suspended between two very opposite planes of reality. Stimulation coming in through my sensory systems felt like pure pain. Light burned my brain like wildfire, and sounds were so loud and chaotic that I could not pick a voice out from the background noise, and I just wanted to escape. Because I could not identify the position of my body in space, I felt enormous and expansive, like a genie just liberated from her bottle. And my spirit soared free like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria. Nirvana. I found nirvana. And I remember thinking there's no way I would ever be able to squeeze the enormousness of myself back inside this tiny little body. But then I realized, but I'm still alive. I'm still alive, and I have found nirvana. And if I have found nirvana and I'm still alive, then everyone who is alive can find nirvana. And I pictured a world filled with beautiful, peaceful, compassionate, loving people who knew that they could come to this space at any time, and that they could purposely choose to step to the right of their left hemispheres and find this peace. And then I realized what a tremendous gift this experience could be. What a stroke of insight this could be to how we live our lives. And it motivated me to recover. 2.5 weeks after the hemorrhage, the surgeons went in and they removed a blood clot the size of a golf ball that was pushing on my language centers. Here I am with my mama, who's a true angel in my life. It took me 8 years to completely recover. So, who are we? We are the life force power of the universe with manual dexterity and 2 cognitive minds. And we have the power to choose moment by moment who and how we want to be in the world. Right here, right now, I can step into the consciousness of my right hemisphere where I am the life force power of the universe. I am the life force power of the 50 trillion beautiful molecular geniuses that make up my form, at one with all that is. Or I can choose to step into the consciousness of my left hemisphere, where I become a single individual, a solid, separate from the flow, separate from you. I am Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, intellectual, neuroanatomist. These are the we inside of me. Which would you choose? Which do you choose? And when?
Wow, that's really something.
I don't know if you've seen this before. It's one of the early TED Talks. It's pretty powerful.
Amazing.
So I think that when I first saw this, I saw this probably 10 years ago. So I was surprised. I guess the thing that most surprised me was that she had to have a stroke to realize that she had a right side of her brain. It was almost like, wow. I guess if you're a scientist and that you're constantly thinking with the left side of your brain, then it's hard for you to imagine that there's another way of thinking, there's another way of experiencing reality. It was very clear from the way she's describing things. I'll share the link in a second. The way that she's describing things, it seems that this was very new to her. And one might say that not only was it new to her, but in the end, she's so not versed with being able to move between these two pictures of reality that she has to say it's either or. She's not looking for a balance between them, or she can't even talk about them. And I mentioned that she just flew through where the balance happens. She didn't even really tend to take time to think about it. But what she called the corpus callosum, which is what we call the middle brain or the hindbrain, is what in Kabbalah is identified with. If we want to identify dat with something, we identify it with the corpus callosum. It's the part that ends up going into the spinal cord. And it is the middle axis in a very real sense. So now, if we would have to define it, then we would say that godliness is that middle axis. It's not that the two left and right axes, the left hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere of the brain, the feeling of self, which is associated with the left side, the feeling of universality, or what you call here nirvana, associated with the right side. It's not that they're not godly, but they're an extreme take on godliness. And so on the one hand, God wants every individual to have a separate identity. And on the other hand, he also wants us to have a universal identification with everything, which comes from the right hemisphere. But those are, like I said, lopsided. They're extreme pictures of what godliness is. There are people who say God is, well, they'll use a different word, but they mean the same thing. That God is in the details. That if you can't, like for instance, when you learn halacha, when you learn Jewish law, if you can't get down to the smallest, minutest details, then you're not really learning Torah. Then you're sort of doing a cursory a job on something that needs to be detailed and analyzed to the smallest iota. And so you would say you haven't found godliness yet in the text if you don't get to that level of analysis. On the other hand, when you're praying, then there's the other side of things, which is that maybe you're looking for the identification with everything, the feeling of, again, she described as nirvana, of not being separate from God. But the truth is that neither of them is a very good description. Both of them are extreme pictures. And the godliness really appears, according to Chassidus, in the middle axis. It's in the balancing between these two pictures. And exactly what does this balance look like is a topic that we could discuss now for hours on end. But I want to take a few examples based a little bit on what she described in order to try to grab some of what the middle axis really looks like. So the first thing is this contrast between being small and distinct and being large and indistinct, or unable to separate myself, not feeling the self. It's very interesting the way she described it. She said very nicely that when you lose touch with the self as distinct, you suddenly begin to fill the world. You suddenly begin to ask the question, how can I even fit into this small body? This reminds us right away of something the Maggid of Mezrich said about the Alter Rebbe when he first saw him in his Beit Midrash, in his study hall. The Alter Rebbe was sleeping, and then they didn't have places to sleep. So they slept in the study hall or near it, in one of the rooms near it. And the Maggid of Mezrich came at night to see that everybody had a place to sleep. And he saw the Alter Rebbe for the first time. He saw the founder of Chabad. He was in his teens or late teens, maybe 20 then. And he saw him sleeping, and he said, how can such a big God fit into such a small body? Because he saw him spiritually. He saw his spiritual presence. But right away, here's the link between the two. That if you're able to balance, then the feeling is that as great as and as expansive as the soul is, and the soul is godly, it's a part of God above, it can fit, it's meant to fit into this body, into this life. Nirvana is almost a sense of life can never do justice to what I am. But when you bring the two together, it's an understanding that godliness is going to be discovered by combining these opposites, by taking this infinite expanse and infinite potential and limiting it and saying, I cannot fulfill all my potential, but I should not despair from fulfilling the part of my potential that is my role in this lifetime. That becomes godliness. The willingness on the one hand to accept that I will always feel, as the sages say, that I haven't completed half of what I want, because there's so much left that could have been done, that should have been done. And yet, I take the pleasure and the commitment to do what I can, even though it's limited. Right? That's maybe the most important lesson that Torah in general and Chassidus in particular teaches. That though God is infinite and all-powerful, he chooses this world, this reality as it is. It's a very hard thing for a lot of people to understand. That this reality is so important that all the infinite potential would be contracted, concentrated into here. It almost doesn't make sense. Some people are left, how should I say, dissatisfied with religion because religion makes you choose. It limits you. The Torah limits you. It says, do this and don't do that. Well, if God is so big, why would he limit me? Because he's limited himself. He's contracted himself. And that same process is something that I have to go through. To say it in a different vein, not in just my personal self, the fulfillment of my person, but also the fulfillment of my relationships. Everybody at some point said to their parents, I wish you weren't my parents, right? It's just a common thing. Why do we feel that way? Because we feel that, well, our parents are maybe, for most people, the first meeting, the first encounter we have with the fact that life is limited, that you can't do anything you want and everything you want. And so they limit us and they pressure us. And people feel resentment. The pressure can sometimes be not very adult-like. It can be childish. Parents are not perfect people, at least most people's parents. So they make mistakes that are childish. They can be abusive. The question is whether godliness is in breaking through and discarding them, whether godliness is an understanding in the same vein that those limits imposed on me are exactly what's needed for me to function in this reality. It's re-narrating the frustration and discouragement that I had, and we all have as children, and understanding that those things that chopped off possibilities were actually what made me into what I am now. And so I needed that. That was part of the process of taking this huge, expansive soul and fitting it into a limited space. The same thing happens in marital relationships. Exactly the same thing. Everybody tires from their spouse at some point. It can happen after 3 months of marriage. It can happen after a year. And some lucky people have it happen only after 10 years. But everybody gets there. And then you're faced with a decision. Oh yeah, I'm very spiritual and I can have many, many different relationships, especially when you're male. But I have to come to the realization that beyond my capabilities is what I can actually be good at. And if I really want to become good at a relationship, if I really want to have a relationship that will leave its mark in the world, I have to commit to one. I can have lower grade relationships with other people, but the intimate, the spiritual relationship that I can have with my wife, with my spouse, I can't have with anybody else. So even if I'm tired of them, and like I said, everybody does at some point, that's not the purpose of the relationship. It's not to be engaged all the time. It's not so that it's the most interesting thing I have. There's probably many people who are more interesting for me. But it's a place where I'm fulfilling myself through limiting myself, through commitment. So that's the first thing that really struck me about her description, that she ended up in the end telling you, so you have to choose. You don't really need to choose. What you need to do is to balance, and you need to feel them both. In other words, into my relationship with my parents, into my relationship with my wife, into my relationship with my life, I can always go back to my feeling of being expansive and bring it into the more limited space that I populate as a person. I can take it and contract it. That's really what life is about. That's really what godliness is. That's really what creates the world and creates my world anew all the time. This ability to take the infinite and concentrate it into the finite. And that leads to a feeling of rejuvenation at every moment. That's what the Baal Shem Tov meant when he said that God is recreating the world at every moment. And every moment, God is choosing to take his infinite self and to limit it within this reality. And it's something that we can learn from, because we also have an infinite aspect to us. So I hope this is not too abstract. So I thought I should ask, not everybody has their camera on, but I guess you can raise your hand if you're, there's a way to raise your hand with Zoom. Not sure how it's done. I hope you know how to do it. So I'm wondering how many people here have experienced this right side phenomena of being completely infinite, of not having any limits at all, of just, and not recognizing myself as distinct from the universe, but just being part of it. So I'm wondering how many people, so Bracha says she's had that. And I wonder if anybody else has had, so Dina knows what I'm talking about, Toby knows what I'm talking about. Miriam knows what I'm talking about. I know she knows what I'm talking about. So this is Tesha says she knows what I'm talking about. So this I think it's a staple of almost every single person. And if it's not, you need to practice it with somebody, to feel it once, to feel it twice, to strip yourself of this separate sense of self that we have, that's mostly what we have most of the time. But if you can remember that you also have a different sense of being, which is not separate from everything else, then you can tap into that. I've talked in the past, I think a few times already, trying to convince everybody to do this, but that when we say Shema, that's really what we're trying to tap into. When we say Shema, we're saying that God is one. Basically, we're saying if God is one, so there's no two, I'm not here. So I'm going back into the state where God is all there is. There's nothing else. So if I can tap into that for a moment, even when I say Shema, and I usually tell people, look, it's at least a minute and a half to get into that state. So when you say Shema, you cover your eyes and you finish saying, that's when the sages say that you lengthen or you spend time on the last syllable, which is chad, on the dalit of the chad, So you don't spend time doing because you can't do that. What you spend time is in your mind. And seeing that there's nothing but God in the world. And that's a way of breaking through, completely breaking through the state of being a separate self. But you don't stay there because you want to balance it and you want to bring it into the limited reality. You open your eyes afterwards. So we don't have much time. I want to give another example of the balance that we have. Hazinum, this parsha is usually read between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It doesn't come out this year that way, but most of the years it is. And in many ways, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the heavens and the earth. Rosh Hashanah is about the earth. Why is it about the earth? Because we're coronating God as master of this reality. On Rosh Hashanah, I think we talked about this in 2 classes ago or 1 class ago, I'm not sure. To coronate God means that God has a vested interest in this reality. It means that it matters what I do. It means that I want to think about what I plan on doing this year. I think I told the story that one year Rav Steinsaltz confided in us, and he told us on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, I think about everything that he didn't do in the previous year. But on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, I make plans for what I will do this year. So it's still not too late, right? You can still do that because there's plenty of time still. Rosh Hashanah is just the beginning of the year. So you can do it any day during the year. But it's a very auspicious time to do it because it's like I'm convincing God, as it were, there's a reason for you to be king here. There's a reason for you to be involved here because here there are people who are dedicated to your values. I'm one of them, hopefully.
Yeah, may I say something to the right state, the exalted state or the right state of the brain?
Sure.
I think there are times, and I don't wish this on anyone, that sometimes we're so in ourselves that it takes a trauma of some sort or something happening in one's life that's so outside of what happened. I mean, God forbid we should have to experience that. But sometimes we need to be lifted out of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it takes something that happens that's so like otherworldly, that literally takes us out of ourselves, literally out of our bodies.
So just to strengthen what you're saying, but to make it better, is that every time that the students went to the Baal Shem Tov for Brengen, that's exactly what happened. It doesn't have to be traumatic in the sense of something negative. Being with a real tzaddik and losing track of time and space and losing track of yourself and being, as it's called in the Zohar, like sucked into his reality is a way to do this without any negative consequences, usually. Sometimes it works, but usually there's no negative consequences. And it comes from a good place. You can get to this from both traumatic events, which sometimes draw you out of yourself, but it can also be done in the positive sense when you join with someone who's balanced properly and who's able to call that up at will. Call it up at will, not in the sense, again, of leaving reality, because he's talking and he's addressing people. He's not in a meditative state. But because he's so connected above and below at the same time, it's like he's a ladder that you too can climb. You can use him as a ladder to climb up also, and not just to remain below. there's a beautiful way that Tzvi Freeman called it in his book. I think it's a translation from Yiddish. In Yiddish we say "Ois Welt in Welt," like out of the world and in the world. He called it. He had a few names for it. Maybe somebody remembers here. He called it his books. What does he call them? Bringing heaven down to earth, or something like that. It was said, the Baal Shem Tov said this, that it was difficult for him for many years to be able to be connected above and still understand the problems of a regular person. Meaning people came to him with problems and he couldn't understand them because he was connected too strongly above. So he eventually said it was given to him as a gift to be able to balance it in such a way that, at least for all intents and purposes, and one at the same time, he was both above and below. That's what usually is meant, that he was in two places at the same time. We don't really mean that he was physically in two places at the same time. What we mean is that he was able to be connected above and be connected below at the same time. There's many stories about being lopsided. For instance, the Alter Rebbe once was in his study upstairs, and he heard a baby crying, and it was the child of the Midler Rebbe, of his son, meaning as it was his grandson who had fallen out of the crib. And he went down to calm him, and he was very surprised to see when he entered the room that his son, the Midler Rebbe, the baby's father, was in the same room, but he couldn't hear the cries because he was so engrossed inside his otherworldly expanded consciousness experience that he couldn't hear the cry of a child. So afterwards, when the time came, the Alter Rebbe explained to him that that is not Chassidus. It's true, you were in a very high place, it's all very nice, but that's not life. That's not Torah, that's not Yiddishkeit. That, this idea that there's a source, that God is both above and below at the same time, that's the essence of godliness. That's where we're striving for. So on Rosh Hashanah, that's what we started with, we're coronating God here below. On Yom Kippur, we're in a completely different place. We're going up into the heavens. Even the Alter Rebbe says in the Shulchan Aruch that the simplest Jew on Yom Kippur is an angel. We go up to, we're like the hosts, like the angels before God on Yom Kippur. We're in a completely different place. And then Parashat hazinum is the balance between the two, telling you that it's not here or there. It has to be here and there. Why is this call it the testament? I want to say the last will and testament of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was in his essence. He is Da'at. He is consciousness itself, the conscientiousness itself that's always weighing between these two sides. It's true that in the beginning of his career, it didn't work out so well because he went up to receive the Torah, which really means probably that he was somewhere on the mountain in a state of being outside his body. And he didn't realize that it was time to come back. So as far as the people were concerned, he was late. The first thing you expect from somebody like this is, if you're going to bring us the Torah, you should bring it back. Don't just leave us and go wherever you're going. So in the beginning, it wasn't so balanced. But here at the end of his life, he tells us, the thing I can give you the most, the thing that the Torah can give you the most, and the Torah is Moses' Torah. It's how the prophet Malachi calls it. Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi. Remember the Torah of my servant Moses. The Torah is Moses' self. It itself is like having Moshe Rabbeinu inside of us. And so he gives us this at the very end. This is like when you write, by the way, because of this, there's many opinions that you should learn the Song of hazinum by heart. That's like impregnating oneself or integrating into our minds the power of balance, balancing all the different things that we need to balance in life. And most importantly, this part between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and becoming centered on the corpus callosum, on the middle brain, and therefore being able to bring infinite godliness and infinite goodness into a limited reality.